Hi, fun friends. We've got Cynthia Thurlow here today, and she is a nurse practitioner and a CEO of the Everyday Wellness Project. She also wrote an incredible book that you can see if you're watching this called The Intermittent Fasting Transformation that I just got to go through. And it is literally packed with tons of valuable, insightful, and really cutting edge information. So thank you, Cynthia, for coming on the show. I couldn't be more excited to have you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I've really been looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, me too. And I got to watch your TED Talk also, which is kind of a great thing that you've done. It was really powerful and succinct and just spoke to the incredible benefits of intermittent fasting. So that's what we're going to focus on primarily today, and for all the stages of life and tips and tricks on how to get started and how to maintain this lifestyle. But before we get into all that goodness, Cynthia, why don't you tell us how you got here and why you became so passionate specifically about intermittent fasting?
Well, I'm trained as a traditional allopathic nurse practitioner. I worked in ER medicine initially as a nurse and then transitioned effortlessly into cardiology. I love everything about the heart and I love the kind of critical care environment. I loved taking care of really sick, medically complex patients. But over time, and certainly, I did that for 16 years. Over time, and after becoming a parent, it really started to get me guessing a little bit about the interrelationship between nutrition and health. And so, as many people know, nurses, doctors, nurse practitioners, et cetera, get little to no training in terms of nutrition. And most of it is based off of the food guide pyramid, AKA My Plate, which, as you and I both know, is a bunch of garbage. And so for me, there was this pivot from looking at root cause approaches versus looking at symptom management. And so initially I thought I wanted to do a PhD program. And so I started a program, took one class and hated it. That was not the right decision for me. And then I did a wellness coaching program, a well-respected one. And then I read a book called Eat the Yolks. And Eat the Yolks for me was a book that really changed the trajectory of what I was doing, because I reached out to the author and I said, this is so contrary to everything I've learned about nutrition and the value of food. Where did you get your training? She told me where she got her training. I think I signed up the next day and that lit me up. So I did this functional nutrition program. And about a year later, I woke up one morning and said to my husband, I cannot write another prescription. And my husband, who's very fiscally conservative, was like, what are you talking about? And I was like, I need to quit my job. And so without a business plan at all, just blind faith and confidence that I would be successful, which my husband laughs about now, but I look at it and I'm like, I'm kind of horrified that I actually literally had no idea what I was doing. I quit my job and I leapt into the entrepreneurial space. And for anyone who's an entrepreneur, this is not typically the way they recommend you do things. The really great thing, however, was that prior to leaving clinical medicine, I had started intermittent fasting initially in an effort to get rid of some weight that seemed to have suddenly appeared on my body. I had never had a problem maintaining my weight, even after pregnancies and breastfeeding and all these things. And perimenopause is the 5 to 10 years preceding menopause. And no one ever told me about this time in my life. Not my mother, not my GYN, not my midwife, no girlfriends. No one talks about this. And so I literally hit perimenopause. Like I ran into a wall. I was doing all the wrong things. I was probably not getting enough sleep. I had a super stressful job. You can imagine cardiology of the sickest patients, a lot of responsibility, 2 young kids, a husband who did a lot of international travel. And I probably was a little too low carb for me. And so when I hit that wall, I started thinking about the things that I could do to kind of swing my health back to where it had been, because I'd always been active and healthy. And intermittent fasting was really what gave me back my vitality and feeling like I was back in control. And so that slowly started to eke its way into conversations with patients and with clients when I started my business. And the irony is, I was profitable pretty quickly because I started attracting exactly the same type of woman that was feeling stuck in middle age, didn't have enough resources, was confused about what was happening to their body, didn't understand what they should or shouldn't be doing, because the conventional wisdom when you're in your 20s and 30s is exercise more, eat less, eat many meals and snacks all day long. All the things that we know are not particularly helpful long-term. And so for me, intermittent fasting started as, like a personal journey. And then The irony is that in 2018, I decided as an introvert, I wanted to do a TED Talk because this would be like a big, scary goal, speak in front of people I don't know and commit something to memory. And so one talk turned into two. And my second talk is the one that people know me for. The irony being was that, the decision to talk about intermittent fasting was as easy as me looking at my husband and saying, I'd already accepted my first talk. That was talking about perimenopause. But you can't do another talk about the same topic. And I said, what do I know a lot about? And he said, intermittent fasting. And it was that easy. So I really think energetically, it was meant to happen the way that it did. And obviously the rest is history. But now that has become a platform that I really speak on, and one that I feel firmly entrenched is lacking in most people's kind of philosophies and their relationship with food and food frequency and meal choices. All of these things have a huge net impact on how healthy we are, both men and women, not just women. But I think both genders, obviously, it's really important for us to understand the methodology and why this strategy can be so impactful.
Yes. Well, thank you for that. There's so much in there. I'm turning 40 in September, so I'm creeping up on that transition myself, and I'm getting prepared, and I've got a lot of questions for you. But also, I love that fasting allows anybody who wants to better their health to start where they're at, right? Because this whole dietary overhaul, and we'll talk about that, what that can look like, but it also works for people who are coming from the standard American diet and then are just like, you know what, I don't want to change a bunch of stuff, but I still want to move the needle. And I like that you say, when you eat is as powerful as what you eat. Sometimes the combination is obviously the most powerful, but such cool stuff. And so we're going to get into defining intermittent fasting. But first, I always ask two personal questions, and this should be really easy and probably something I can guess, but what did you eat for breakfast, Cynthia?
Nothing. I had green tea and I had some supplements. Exactly. I went to the gym. I had a lot of water, came home, had some green tea and took some supplements. And now when we're done with our podcast, I'll actually break my fast.
Okay, that's good. So green tea, are you looking for improved benefits? Is that going to enhance your fasting somehow? First question. Second question, what supplements are you taking, and do you consider them to not break your fast?
Great question. So green tea has polyphenols that are ingredients that can help potentiate, magnify some of the benefits from fasting. I'm admittedly not a coffee drinker. I never have been. I don't like the taste. And so even when people say to me, I don't like coffee, I don't like bitter teas, I remind them that the polyphenols in those drinks are really powerful information for our bodies to kind of process. They can upregulate some of the fat oxidation related to intermittent fasting. And so I jokingly brew my tea every morning for my husband as well, because he's also not a coffee drinker. I let it cool and then I sip it with a straw. So this is this ongoing joke that many people assume I'm this big green tea person. I'm really not. I don't love the taste, but I recognize the importance of what's in the tea for my health and kind of potentiating the impact of intermittent fasting. Now, when it comes to supplements, this is a dual-edged sword because some supplements will not break your fast. As an example, like magnesium is not going to break your fast. However, if you're consuming collagen peptides, if you're consuming amino acids, things like that, those types of things will break your fast. So in the morning, I'm generally sticking to things that are not going to break my fast. I'm also in the midst of a candida cleanse, which is a whole separate tangential conversation. So some of the things I took this morning, in addition to my magnesium and a couple other supplements, are things related to getting rid of the candida that does not belong in my gut. And I was just as surprised as you probably are to realize, because I didn't have the classic symptoms of candida. I wasn't having crazy cravings, but it's probably from all the international travel we've done. I picked up a couple parasites and had a bunch of candida. And so we got through the parasite protocol. Now I'm working on candida. So some things are specific to that.
Okay, fantastic. And yeah, like you're saying, it's kind of an opportunistic little guy that if you're overworked or traveling a lot, and also if you have parasites, that if you don't ever get rid of them, then they can just feed the candida. So you don't ever want to go after the candida without addressing the parasites and all that stuff. So we've talked about that. I just wanted to highlight that again. Okay, awesome. Well, very, very cool, Cynthia. So now let's just define it and talk about, okay, what exactly is intermittent fasting, and what are the many benefits? You did a beautiful job in your book, and I have some notes of things I specifically want to hit, but what would you say are the most powerful benefits of intermittent fasting?
Intermittent fasting really gets a bad rap sometimes. It's as simple as eating less often. It doesn't mean you don't eat. It doesn't mean you starve. It just means you eat within a prescribed time period. And it could be an 8-hour window, it could be a 6-hour window, it could be a 4-hour window. Once you're fat adapted, once your body is able to flex between using carbohydrates and fats as a fuel source, then you have a lot of flexibility in terms of when you choose to eat and what you choose to eat. In terms of benefits, one of my favorites is this kind of nerdy scientific term called autophagy. And when we're not eating, our body spends time and effort to get rid of diseased and disorganized organelles and proteins and misfolded things that don't belong. It's like taking out the garbage. And it's important for people to understand we have to find a balance. Like there's one system in the body called mTOR that's activated when we eat. And then autophagy really upregulates when we don't eat. It's not to suggest that we're trying to find balance between both. It's not one is good, one is bad. And I think that's really important. I think there's very much this reductionistic thinking mTOR is bad and autophagy is good. Well, they're both good. We just want to make sure we find a balance. So the getting rid of disease disordered proteins and things that don't belong, taking out the garbage with autophagy is my number one biggest benefit. I would say that people are oftentimes surprised that once they are in a position where their hormones are better balanced and they have lowered insulin levels, they will get, their body will actually be able to go in and utilize a special type of fat, broken down into ketones. And there's one called beta hydroxybutyrate. And this diffuses beautifully across the blood-brain barrier. And I remind people that our brain really actually loves fat as a fuel source. It potentiates energy. It provides tremendous mental clarity. I remind people that this is one of those benefits that people oftentimes don't realize until they start. And it was certainly for me, one that reinforced the good habits because I felt so good. I could sit down and do a podcast, or I could sit down and, crank through a couple hours of writing and not have to worry about eating. And I was so mentally clear. But let me just mention that insulin is not a bad hormone. We hear a lot of negative things about insulin. Insulin, much like every other hormone in the body, just really needs to be balanced. So when we're not eating, our insulin levels are lower, and it allows us to tap into these fat stores for energy. I also think about the reduction in neurocognitive disorders. So when we're talking about Alzheimer's, vascular dementia, Parkinson's, even multiple sclerosis, we're seeing a lot of really great emerging research. And this is certainly very important because most women are protected cognitively until they go through menopause. And why is that? That has a lot to do with estradiol. So estradiol is the predominant form of estrogen in our bodies prior to going through menopause. And estradiol has insulin sensitizing properties, which is beneficial for us. That's why women have lower risk of cardiovascular disease and neurocognitive issues until we go through menopause, when if we're not using bioidenticals or hormonal replacement therapy, it can be much more challenging for us to maintain insulin sensitivity. And that's why we start to see escalating rates of insulin resistance, obesity, diabetes, and the cognitive issues. So certainly I like to focus a lot on brain health. And so those are a couple of the things. I also think about a lot of the biophysical markers. We think about blood pressure, we think about fasting glucose, we think about lipid profiles, all improve with fasting and getting your insulin under better control. We also know that people that are fasted and maintaining healthy weights are at less risk for certain types of cancer. A lot of the female reproductive cancers, in particular, colorectal cancer, breast cancer, uterine cancer, et cetera, which tend to be much more common in westernized communities. And then lastly, I think a great deal about just having the freedom of not having to worry about an extra meal every day, having the ability to understand that you can go from one meal to another, not be hungry, be properly fueled, be mentating, or have a lot of cognitive function that's very clear mentally, and just have the I call it food freedom, where you're not fixated on when your next meal is coming because your blood sugar is stable, you're able to make good choices, you have sustained energy, you're able to lose weight. I remind people that when people are dealing with weight loss resistance, it's more often than not a hormonal imbalance in the body that needs to be addressed. And sometimes this is, again, a departure from that kind of old dogma that talks about calories in, calories out, and it's very reductionistic and believes that that's really the reason why we effortlessly lose weight or don't. And I'd be the first person to say it's far more sophisticated than that and really speaks to hormonal imbalances.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Thanks for all of those reasons. And I just wanted to highlight some that stood out from your book so that people go. Also is the gut benefits and how you can actually, like you were saying, weight loss resistance. One of the reasons they've found is a lack of diversity in the gut, and some bacteria survive and thrive when you're fasting and others when you're feeding. And so the combination, and you even wrote how it can turn white fat into brown fat, potentially through this mechanism in the gut, which I thought was awesome. And not only for the brain in terms of like cognitive function, because yesterday I did a podcast not fasting, rode the struggle bus hard the whole time, which is why today I decided, okay, we're going to be fasting today. And also only in addition to the clarity is serotonin. Right. So it helps to produce that or to help preserve the production of it, which actually makes us feel a lot better. And lastly, I think something that's everyone's interested in, and maybe we already know this, but the immune system. We know monocytes are less active, it seems, in periods of fasting. So yeah, like you said, so many benefits. Thank you for laying that out beautifully. I'd also like to talk about what windows of time are you working with? Like, where do you have people start, and what's the longest you like them to go, and kind of like how regularly?
I think it really depends on the individual. I think a good starting place, and this typically will freak people out if they're having 3 meals a day and snacks and snacking after dinner. I just want them to go from dinner to breakfast. And for a lot of people, that is a completely mind blowing. And I remind them, I'm like, listen, if you're sleeping for 8 hours a night, you've already gone through most of that 12 hours or 13 hours of digestive rest. And so really starting out small, starting with a small window. But even before we do that, I usually recommend they stop snacking, because that is in of itself a huge problem. Not only are you not allowing your body to properly break down, detoxify, the migrating motor complex, all these sophisticated mechanisms that are involved in our gastrointestinal tract to keep us healthy. When you're eating with greater meal frequency, your insulin's up and all these other mechanisms are dysregulated. But I like them to start with not snacking. That's number one. And then that will force you to kind of rethink your macros. So your protein, fat, and carbohydrates. And so I always say, push the protein lever. That is the most satiating macronutrient. And I'd be the first person to say, I'm very pro animal-based protein, as I know you are as well. And if you're eating enough protein, you're not going to be looking to eat anything else. You're going to be full. So really thinking about protein, non-starchy vegetables, predominantly some healthy fats, and you've got a meal. So if you're hitting your macros properly, you're not going to be hungry between your meals. And then the idea of going from dinner to breakfast doesn't seem quite so overwhelming. So we start low and slow. And then we're aiming ideally to go to 16 hours fasted, but that could take some people, it could take them 2 months. Others, it may take 2 weeks. Really depends on the individual, depends on how metabolically flexible they are to begin with. Obviously, the more carbohydrate dependent you are, the more weight you have to lose. It may take a little bit longer. And so I always say everyone's on their own trajectory.
Yeah.
But I also think it's important for people to understand, like, once they've mastered the concept of a fasting and a feeding window, once they're fat adapted, once their body's able to effectively use carbohydrates and fat as fuel sources, and fat flexibility means you go back and forth. It's not like you're stuck in the fat burning mode solely. Then you can start experimenting with longer fasting windows and more variety. And I'm certainly a huge proponent of that. I talk about some of those challenges in intermittent fasting transformation. I do like longer fasts, but I like people to make sure that they're in a position where they're getting those small wins before they try to go for a 24-hour fast, before they think about a 30-hour fast, before they think about, a 2 or 3 day fast. And obviously there are different mechanisms in the body that are upregulated in longer fasts, as opposed to shorter fasts. But it's almost like I always say, monogamy is good, but fasting monogamy, we want to change things up. We don't want to eat the same food every day. We don't want to exercise the same way every single day. And so I think it's important, once you've mastered the basics, to work on different variations. Now, a very common question is, do I fast for really long periods of time? And my standard kind of non-snarky answer is, not since 2019, because I had a 13-day hospitalization. But prior to that, I did some longer fasts. I think since that time, I haven't done more than a 48-hour fast, and I really prefer not doing fasts longer than that. It kind of brings me back to a time when I was quite sick, but I do, walk women through doing longer, prolonged fasts, how to do it successfully, not to buy into the adage that you need to eat things during a long fast, unless you're really, let's be clear. Sometimes there are people that have to break their fast early. It could be, best example, on the days I lift, I don't fast as long as I do on days I don't lift, because I'm hungrier much earlier, and I lean into that hunger, those hunger cues. But I think it's important for people to understand there's not a lot of rigidity in fasting. I like people to understand that they can lean into their hunger cues. They can lean into where they are in their menstrual cycle. They can lean into what's going on in their personal life, and they can adjust their fasting and feeding windows accordingly.
Love that. And yes, I want to talk about kind of a few of the ways to do that. But first, you said something that I think is going to be really helpful for people, because I work with women and they're like, you know what, I can't fast. Like, I don't feel good when I don't eat. And so let's talk about fat adaptation. Like, what is happening in this process? And is that something that we can push through or learn for pretty much everybody? Or are there people that you think really can't do this?
Well, I think that's a great question. Bioindividuality rules. So I think there are people who are not going to tolerate fasting in certain situations in their lives, and that has to be respected. More often than not, people don't tolerate fasting because they're sugar burners, which means their body never gets the ability to utilize fat as stored fuel, although they have a lot of stored fuel. So let's back up a little bit and remind people that when we're overeating, or we're eating to excess, our body will store excess fuel in the form of fat. And fat in and of itself is a very sophisticated organ in the body. It is not just fat. It's not just adipose tissue. It's inflammatory cytokines. There's all this upregulation or dysregulation of key hormones like leptin and ghrelin. So you can be obese and be almost nutrient deprived because your body can't properly utilize the food that's stored as fat. So I think it's always important for people to understand context. And Jason Fung does a really beautiful job explaining this, and I want to give him credit for this when he talks about the refrigerator. And so in the refrigerator, the carbohydrates are in the refrigerator and the fat is in the freezer. And so you have to work through what's in the stored carbohydrates, the stored glucose, predominantly in your liver and skeletal muscle, before you can actually get into the freezer to free up that stored fat. And so you have to go to a point of time in which you are not eating with so much frequency. Do I meet women who can go 12 hours and they're okay? Yes. Do I meet women that can only fast during a certain part in their menstrual cycle? Absolutely. Do I meet women who are just not ready for fasting? Absolutely. And I think that it has to be something you want for yourself. It can't be because your best friend is doing it, or your sister or your spouse or whomever. It has to be when you are ready, the message will come. And so I'm a huge proponent of saying, don't force an outcome. If it's not working for you, you can always revisit it. There have been times in my adult life since I started fasting, certainly after being in the hospital for 13 days and losing 15 pounds, there were months where I did not fast. I was not in any position to fast. And I tell people all the time, there was a 3-month period of time where I did not fast. And then when I started gaining back healthy weight, I was able to get back to fasting. I could stabilize my blood sugar. And so I think it's always in the context of what someone's personal circumstances are, how much they're willing to move the needle, because fasting is a muscle, meaning, you have to, it's going to require you to do things that are going to make you a little uncomfortable, like any hormetic stress, whether it's high intensity interval training, whether it's fasting, whether it's cryotherapy or cold plunges or infrared sauna. They're not designed to be comfortable. It's, a certain amount of stress at the right time in the right amount that makes us stronger. And so I have to sometimes do a lot of mindset work with women to say, I don't want you to suffer. That is not what I'm saying. I wouldn't be a fan of anyone doing that. However, do I love doing high intensity interval training? No. Is it good for my body? Yes. Do I do it anyway? Yes. And so it might be that you coast doing 13 hours of fasting for a month, and then you slowly go to 13 and a half, and then maybe you go to 14, and then maybe that's the best you can do for a while. And that is okay. The concept of comparisonitis. I mean, I see people wearing this badge of honor that they do 24-hour fast multiple times a week. And I always say there's this law of diminishing returns. Like, what are you aiming to do? And I would be the first person to say, lean people, like you and I are lean people, there's a law of diminishing returns. At what point I just say, what are you trying to do? Because for me, there's no value in doing a 36-hour fast or 48-hour fast. I genuinely don't like doing it. And I'm not going to get that much more bang for my buck, if you will, if I'm trying to, fat oxidation or whatever my goal is. And so I think you have to be very clear about what your goal is and be kind to yourself. I think we as women in particular do a really crummy job of putting so much pressure on ourselves to, whether it's a number on the scale, whether it's a pant size they want to be, whether it's, and I've heard this often, people say, I want to be the weight I was in high school. And I was like, well, I don't know about you, but I'm a lot different than I was in high school. And I wouldn't necessarily want to be, exactly that same weight. I'd rather have some muscle on my body and be more metabolically flexible than just be skinny. And so I think it's always kind of reframing, like, what do you really want and desire? And generally I advise people to stay off the scale. Like if you're going to do it like once a month, but don't do it obsessively every single day.
Love that. I love that. I often have people use like HRV or something a little bit what I think is more meaningful. And I love that you said you don't do a long fast. I don't either. I think dinner to dinner is the longest I ever fast. And my husband in solidarity wanted to do a 3-day bone broth fast. And so I did 2 days. And then it started to hurt my sleep. And I was like, nah, I'm going to listen to my body and let that wisdom trump everything else. So, and one follow-up question to what you just said, which I thought was so wonderful, because I know you're knowledgeable about this. People who are insulin resistant, who come to this, do you find that it is more difficult for them to see results than someone who is not insulin resistant, or is that not the case?
It's a great question. And I think, part of it is most of us are insulin resistant, even if we're not aware of it, because there's a great 2018 study from UNC Chapel Hill School of Public Health that talked about 88.2% of people were metabolically inflexible here in the US. And that was in 2018. So I'm sure in 2022, it's probably above 90%. So I think a lot of people are insulin resistant and don't realize that they are. They struggle to lose weight, but they don't realize that part of it's this hormonal dysregulation. Do I think it's harder for people that are insulin resistant? No, I don't think so. I think if they're properly intrinsically properly motivated, not me being the only person that's trying to motivate them, I think that it requires a bit more finesse because the insulin receptors on the cell have gotten lazy. Like I always tell my kids, the way I describe insulin resistant is it's like you're knocking on the door and it's like a muffled sound. Like the body just can't hear the receptor signaling that's going on. So it can take a bit of time to resensitize those receptors. And I tell people all the time, like diabetes and insulin resistance are fixable, but it requires work. And so if someone's properly intrinsically motivated, I think it is absolutely positively something that can come to fruition. I'll give you a great example. One of my best friends from childhood who's given me permission to talk about this called me and told me what her A1C, fasting insulin, fasting blood sugar were, and a bunch of other triglycerides and a few other markers. And I said, so what did your doctor tell you? So we went to see an endocrinologist, so someone who's supposed to be a diabetes expert. And he told me to take magnesium and that maybe I need to eat less. And I said, okay, was that valuable information? Because I don't think that sounds valuable. And so I spent like an hour talking to her, allowing her to understand how like the physical activity, the sleep quality, the stress management, her nutritional choices, and a slew of other things, being in perimenopause was not helping, was impacting. I said, did he tell you of diabetes? And she said, no. And I said, this is one of the things I'm most frustrated with is that I don't like saying to a patient, you have diabetes. And they'll say, well, this is what my labs will look like for years. And it's because someone doesn't want to have that difficult conversation. And this has become a public health crisis in my estimation. And so we really have to call it what it is. It is a public health crisis. And everyone that's listening, there are specific lab markers that they're not functional or integrated medicine markers. You can ask for fasting insulin. I just interviewed Dr. David Perlmutter yesterday. He does an amazing new book called Drop Acid, talking about uric acid and its interrelationship with metabolic health. And so these are things that are paid by insurance that you should be able to go to your provider and ask for. And we'll give you a snapshot of metabolic health along with like looking at your triglycerides and what your HDL is, your good cholesterol, and what your waist circumference is. Do you have high blood pressure problems? All of those things are mitigated by insulin resistance. And so it's important to have like a total snapshot to say, I'm either on the right path or I've got work to do. And I think for all of us, there are always opportunities to tweak things so that we can become healthier, become more knowledgeable. And it's not to suggest that any of us live in a life of deprivation. I think if anything, the healthier I eat, the better I take care of myself, the better I feel. And so that's this like validation of why I choose to prioritize sleep and stress manage and, don't eat as often as most of my Western medicine peers and patients, because I want to remain an outlier. Like I'm happy being there, but I would want everyone to have the same quality of life that we have. And understanding that a lot of it is within their control. It's not this out of control freight train, which is what I used to hear from my patients. They would say like, oh, I have no control over this. And I was like, oh, you absolutely do, but it requires hard work. And that's what a lot of people, we've kind of conditioned our patients to ask for prescription medication to treat symptoms, as opposed to saying like, what's really driving this problem? And that's where, I try really, really hard to try to bring that to light so that people can be educated, inspired, empowered to take better care of themselves.
Yeah, I love that. Right. I work with a lot of women who are just like, oh, well, I couldn't fast. Fasting is like unnatural. We have to be eating all these small meals. And like there's this fear that's been created around fasting, whereas it's this ancient, very rejuvenative practice actually. And yeah, there is hard work involved, but it's definitely worth it. And I fast with my cycle, which we'll talk about soon. And I always actually look forward to the parts where I fast because I notice I'm just more patient. And I know there's like a GABA influence, like, which is a very calming neurotransmitter that comes into play. So I know there's fear initially, but it's definitely like it's worth walking through that fear. So I'm trying to
absolutely.
say.
And I think it's important and certainly really validating to discuss the fact that on social media and in the free press, there's a lot of fear mongering that goes on. It actually, I find it disappointing and upsetting because most of the time when I get, someone sends me an article or something's done, and I'm sure I want to believe the person's well-meaning, but we wouldn't be here as a species if we couldn't go through cycles of food scarcity. We would not be here. Like there's just no way we would not have, lived over the past, millennium. And so I think it's really important for understand that fasting is part of all the major religions. It was incorporated into the rituals. And so it's not new or novel. It's not something that just popped up 10 years ago. It has been around for a long time. And however you decide to use fasting in your lifestyle is certainly up to you and what works best. But I don't think anyone should fear it. I think that's an unfortunate byproduct. The processed food industry doesn't want us fasting because we're eating less food.
Exactly. That's what I was going to say. This is breakfast companies saying you have to be eating right when you wake up. Like, no, you don't. People were probably never doing that before. And we are just kind of inundated with marketing and profit-driven motives. And it's very sad, but that's why we're here. So I want to talk about hormones really quick, fast, because we have a few questions around that. So I want you to tell us, like you talked about kind of it being able to heal hormones. And then maybe there's some women, maybe with low levels of hormones or like HPA axis dysfunction, where it might not be that great of idea. So can you talk about that? And then specifically to nursing, pregnancy, lactate, or like pregnancy, nursing. And there was one other question we had, but can you start there? I'm going to find out.
So first and foremost, everyone is their own bio individual. And I use that term a lot because I want people to understand you could take 10 women who are 40 years of age and not everyone might be in the right position at that time to fast. So we have to take into account sleep, stress management, nutritional choices, exercise, just life in general. And I would be the first person to say that when we talk about hypothalamic pituitary axis dysregulation, we're talking a lot about brain health in conjunction with our endocrine organs. And in particular, there's one in particular, our adrenal glands, that gets a lot of focus. And I remind people that when our body thinks we're running a marathon every day, that's not a good thing. So evolutionary wise, we have the autonomic nervous system. And so part of it's the sympathetic, which is I'm being chased by a rabid animal, everything, my vision is clear, my digestion shut down. I'm not going to stop to poop. My, all detoxification pathways are just shut down. I'm trying to run. So all the blood is being shunted to skeletal muscle so I can run away. Versus the parasympathetic, which is the rest and repose, that I'm relaxed, I can have an orgasm, I can digest my food, I can sleep, I feel safe, very different. But in our kind of hedonistic, overstimulated, overharried existence, and the past 2 years have not helped us, most, if not all of us, are sympathetic dominant. And what that means is our body, and we talked about HRV, heart rate variability, it's a good indicator of how balanced we are between this rest and repose and the sympathetic drive to just be like rushing away from danger. But our bodies don't differentiate between being chased by a wild animal, from being stuck in traffic, getting angry at our spouse, getting angry with our kids, which I know we were talking about before we started, and a slew of other stressors that go on, and the pandemic, notwithstanding. So all these things that go on. And a lot of women, we're people pleasers. We take care of all the things. We take care of everything. We oftentimes at our own health's expense. And so maybe in your 20s and 30s, you can get away with not enough sleep, too much stress, too much CrossFit, crazy nutritional choices that you make, a lot of processed foods. And then as you start getting, north of 35, closer to 40, I just find that a lot of women get really worn out. They end up with lower cortisol. Cortisol is a hormone secreted by the adrenal glands in response to being chased by a rabid animal or other, chronic stressors. But over time, your body just gets worn down. And if your cortisol is up for a while and your body's really working hard to deal with that, it means your insulin levels are up. It means your blood sugar's up. It means, your immune function and your gut in particular takes a hit. Your, gut microbiome takes a hit as well as a lot of other downstream effects. So I remind people that if you're incredibly stressed and you're sleeping 4 hours a night and your diet's terrible and you're overexercising, please do not add intermittent fasting. It will not be beneficial to you. In fact, I work very diligently, not just with myself personally, but with all of my clients to make sure that their adrenals are really well supported. Because the other piece of this is that unlike men that are replenishing sperm, I believe every 3 days, if memory serves me correctly, women are born with a finite amount of eggs. So the eggs in our ovaries are as old as we are. So I remind people that yes, you may still get a bleed every month, but you may not be ovulating every month. And so as our ovaries are producing less progesterone, the adrenal glands take another hit. And so this is the beginning stage of perimenopause. There are 5 clinical stages, but a lot of women don't even realize that they're there because they start getting subtle changes, heavier periods, weight gain. They may have more anxiety and depression. They may not sleep as well because progesterone is this GABA influencing hormone. It's the kind of mellow sister hormone. It's what predominates in the second half of the menstrual cycle during our luteal phase. And so it's always under the context of what's going on in your personal life, because as I said before, I've gone through periods in my life where it would not have been appropriate to fast. I think, and this is my dovetail into breastfeeding, trying to conceive, and pregnancy. First of all, we know when you're trying to conceive and when you're pregnant, this is not the time to restrict macro or micronutrients. You are building a human. It can change you at an epigenetic level. It can change the fetus at an epigenetic level. And then while you're breastfeeding, I see a lot of women on social media, and this actually frustrates me because it's the one time in your life that you can actually get away with a little bit more caloric intake. Again, I don't count calories, but I'm just saying more macros because you are feeding a human. If you're breastfeeding in particular, it is not the time to restrict your food intake. A lot of women get very focused on, I want to get back to that one size or the scale or whatever it is they're focused on. Just enjoy this wonderful, delicious bonding time with your baby. That is the most important thing. So I always suggest not fasting under those circumstances, and certainly not fasting if you're not sleeping through the night. So a lot of perimenopausal, menopausal women, even young women who are super stressed, they don't sleep through the night. I'm like, do not add in intermittent fasting. Go back to, go back to the very first spot and figure out why you're not sleeping. And then once that's fixed, then you can think about intermittent fasting. So I think that's a really important distinction, because when we talk about this brain endocrine system communication, if our body perceives we're under imminent threat, danger, etc., it is not the time to add more stress. And the last thing I want to add in there, talking about women that are still cycling, perimenopause, is if you lose your menstrual cycle. So I think of the menstrual cycle, your period, as another vital sign. It's one thing if for a month or two, maybe it's a little lighter, a little heavier, it gets back on track. But if it goes away and you're not pregnant, it could be a sign that it's too much stress for your body, because our brains are intrinsically very attuned. We have follicular stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, all these hormones that are communicating with the ovaries. And if our body says, hey, time out, there's not enough food coming on, there's no way I could support a human, we're going to just shut things down. We're going to make ourselves anovulatory. We're going to be amenorrheic. We're not going to get a menstrual cycle. And so I think that's very, very important, because there's so much misinformation on social media in particular. And it's interesting to me that when I go down a rabbit hole trying to figure out where people are making these blanket statements saying fasting is bad for women, no woman should fast. And I just say that's complete garbage. There are specific times when we shouldn't. And we really have to lean into our physiology. I always say it's wonderful being a woman. I wouldn't want to be any other gender than what I am. But we need to embrace what makes us unique and not look at it as a detrimental aspect of fasting or how we choose to fast. And the last thing that I would add in there is that there's not enough research. There's been a lot of research done on lab animals, which they have a completely different gestational cycle than humans do. And there's been quite a bit of research on women with PCOS and menopausal obese women. Not enough women or not enough research has been done yet. I'm sure that will come, looking at women still at peak fertile years because it's too complicated, as I'm told, or women in perimenopause or even menopause, looking at healthy, people who are metabolically flexible in menopause. So really kind of looking at each stage in a woman's life and seeing how that impacts how we are able to fast successfully or not. But, I always say the N of 1 is what's really powerful. That is anecdotal, meaning, your own experience is still significant. And maybe that will eventually yield to more research being done on women. But, what I keep hearing from my male peers is that because of our menstrual cycles, it's what makes it a little more complicated to study us. And I just say, okay, that's great. We'll do it anyway.
Yes. I hope that we do. And I'm wondering, one of our subscribers asked specifically, do you know, and are you familiar with any of the studies about women in Ramadan? And does that impact the health of the baby or anything like that? Are they still fasting when they're pregnant? Do you even know?
It's funny. Most of the Ramadan studies I've read have been done on men, not as much on women. I think there's a lot of hesitation to do studies on women, period. And especially when they're pregnant, it's like, oh my gosh, no one wants to do that. Having said that, I'm not familiar. I mean, I've done a lot of research on the male aspects, male impact rather of Ramadan and biophysical markers and insulin sensitivity. And I would imagine that if you've got a pregnant woman in Ramadan, I don't know. I have to be completely transparent and say, I don't know enough about the rules about what they do when a woman is pregnant during Ramadan versus just a regular cycling woman versus a menopausal woman, and whether or not they allow for variances on, hydration and food intake. I'm actually not sure.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I've never read anything either, but I'm glad I asked. And thank you for your honesty there. I would like to know, there's two more things I want to discuss quickly before we talk about where they can find your book. And the first is just, like you said, different stages of life. Typically after menopause, it's easier to incorporate more fasting because you're a little bit more stable. Perimenopause is going to be a kind of different situation. So what I do for that is in the first half of my cycle begins. It's actually my easiest day to do a longer fast if I want to. Day 1 is where I usually do my 24-hour fast. As I get closer to ovulation, my fasting windows will shorten. And then usually after ovulation, I don't fast over 14 hours. And the last week before my cycle, I fast 12. Yeah, probably, but I don't push it after that. Now, is there something that you would do differently, or what does your cycle look like?
Yeah, no, I love that you, described that so brilliantly. So typically my general feeling is follicular phase, day 1 of bleeding till we're looking at a 28-day cycle. So let's ideally say we're picking a perfect cycle. Day 1 to day 14, follicular phase, estrogen predominates. Remember, I talked about estrogen sensitivity and how you're much more insulin sensitive during this time frame. You can push your workouts. You can, push the food envelope. You can push the fasting, foot that lever that we talk about. Once a woman has gone through ovulation, if that's transpired, I always say the luteal phase, when progesterone predominates, we become a little less insulin sensitive. This becomes a time, usually the 5 to 7 days preceding our menstrual cycle, where we have to be much more cognizant of the food macros that we're consuming. So you may need a little bit more discretionary high quality carbohydrate. I'm not talking about pounds of carbohydrates. I'm saying like maybe a third or a half a cup more. The closer you are to menopause, the less you tolerate carbohydrates. And certainly, towards the latter stages of your luteal phase, more insulin resistance. So I remind people this is also the time that we don't want to do these long fasts. So 12, 13 hours is completely reasonable. And then once you start bleeding, you can get back to that cycle. But I get DMs from doctor friends all the time. They're like, oh my God, I can barely get through the day. I don't know what's wrong with me. And I'm like, where are you in your cycle? Oh, my cycle's due in 2 days. I'm like, well, that would be why. So really understanding that we're like Wonder Women at the beginning part of our menstrual cycle, and we can really push the fasting envelope, whether it's a 24-hour, a 36-hour, an 18-hour, or 20-hour, whatever works for you and your schedule. And then acknowledging that physiologically we get progesterone predominates second half of the menstrual cycle, and we don't get as much latitude with those fasting windows. And if women really lean into how they feel, that will come naturally. Like that's the beautiful thing, is that this delicate symphony of hormones, if we really lean into how we're feeling, that's exactly what we do. That's exactly what we naturally will do. Just like, as an example, I lifted this morning and I definitely can feel like I definitely need to break my fast earlier. So kind of leaning into those hunger cues, leaning into what your body's telling you, and certainly understanding that the beautiful thing is you can be flexible every day. You don't have to be super rigid, but I do think that understanding where you are in your menstrual cycle can really be very helpful. The question I always get is, if I'm perimenopausal and my cycles aren't as regular, what do I do? And I sometimes will suggest to people, once they've gotten to a point where they're more hormonally balanced and they understand hunger cues, and they can kind of lean into leptin and ghrelins, the hunger and satiety hormones, and they've got better blood sugar and insulin control, that they just need to be mindful. Like if they're craving a lot of carbohydrates, it may not necessarily be that they're, maybe they're not hitting their protein macros as an example, but it could be that their body needs intrinsically a little bit more carbohydrate as they're heading into this progesterone kind of dominant phase in their cycle. But it can be a little bit more confusing when your cycles become more and more irregular. But interestingly enough, I see a lot of women who maybe have irregular cycles that are in perimenopause, that once they start fasting, their cycles become more regular up until when they stop entirely.
Yeah, isn't that beautiful? It can be such a valuable tool. And what I love about what you're saying is it's not about rigidity. And that's what I found about really being in tune with how I'm feeling in my cycle, is that last week, I am very liberal with the carbohydrates because that's what my body wants. And I look forward to that phase rather than like trying to fight myself. And I think it's been a really valuable opportunity for me to take care of myself in that same way, which I'm historically terrible at. Okay, so let's just I want you to tell us where we can get your book. And then the last thing, I loved your thing about macros. It was very unique. It was a very different approach than you'd see. And so tell us, how many protein grams are you hitting? How many carbohydrates are you hitting for just like your average perimenopausal woman? And you can talk about the different ones in the cycle if you want to, but just kind of give us an average and then tell us where we can find your awesome book.
Yeah. So macros are as simple as protein, fat, and carbohydrates. And I think for women, we grossly undereat carbohydrates we grossly undereat protein, we overeat carbohydrates, and we have to kind of flip that. So the average woman, I think based on what I last read, is eating about 50 to 60 grams of protein a day, which is really undernourishing your body. First and foremost, because it's the most satiating macronutrient. Second of all, because north of 40, we are at risk for developing, it's not if, we will develop sarcopenia, this muscle loss with aging. And so we have to be consuming enough animal-based protein, lifting heavy things, and getting high quality sleep to offset that. Now, everything that I've read suggests 1 gram per pound of ideal body weight. Most people, they hear that, it blows their minds. They're like, there's no way I can eat 150 grams a day. So just eat more. So aiming for 40 to 50 grams of protein in each meal. Now, if you are someone that only eats 2 meals in your feeding window, you may want to supplement, whether it's with bone broth, you have a high quality protein shake, etc., to get to your goals. But I always say eat more. Like if you're only at 50 right now, eat 60, eat 5 extra grams with your food. So I think the first and foremost, so stacking your macros that way. Next is non-starchy vegetables. I'm a huge proponent of a variety of brightly pigmented vegetables on your plate, whether it's a salad, whether it's something you batch cook a bunch of broccoli and cauliflower, eggplant, etc., making sure you're integrating those into your lifestyle. Healthy fats are always kind of depends on the individual. A lot of women don't digest their fats very well. And so we talk about high quality fats, as I know your listeners are completely familiar with. But if you have a piece of salmon, you've already got your healthy fats. You don't need to be adding more fat to your meal. If you're eating a ribeye, as an example, if you have a piece of filet or you have a piece of cod that are lower in fat, then maybe you add a couple like cashews, or you throw on some nuts, or maybe you have a pat of butter on your broccoli. You can add in healthy fats, but just being cognizant of the fact that they are more nutrient dense. So the portions need to be smaller. And this is really, it's easier for us to overeat healthy fats. And I say this because cheese and nuts appear to be a challenge for most women. It's like there's the fat content and the salt. It's just like the perfect yumminess for people to overeat. But when it comes to carbohydrates, it really depends on how metabolically flexible you are. Are you insulin resistant? I like whole sources of carbohydrate. So I'm going to advocate for root vegetables and squash and sweet potato over grains and pasta and bread. And no, that doesn't mean that you don't get to enjoy those things every once in a while, but you have to be very mindful of your portions. And no, this is not a sexy topic. This is very triggering for a lot of people. They get angry about it. But the reality is, as we are losing estradiol, we are becoming more insulin resistant. Add in the fact that most of the population is already insulin resistant. And that does not mean you can build your meal around a big bowl of pasta or a big bowl of rice. My teenagers can do that because they're growing and they're very physically active. I'm a healthy, active person, but like I'm not exercising at the level that they are because they're athletes. So I think it's important to not demonize carbohydrates, but be mindful of portions. Now, non-starchy carbohydrates are different from a starchy carbohydrate, like I was alluding to. And the more processed the carbohydrate, the larger impact it is going to have on your blood sugar response. And so I'm also a proponent. I talk about continuous glucose monitors or even glucometers to check your blood sugar response because we're all individuals. I love plantains. Plantains do not like me. It's a very, very sad, sad situation in my house when I found that out after trying them like 5 different ways. Didn't matter. Did the same thing to my blood sugar, but yet I could eat a mango, which makes no sense. So when we're talking about carbs, you may have to measure them until you have a good sense of what you can tolerate. And then understanding, I like to cycle carbs, and that's actually what I recommend is, you have some days where you're lower carb. I'm not saying everyone has to be ketogenic, but if the average American is consuming 200 to 300 grams of carbs a day, it means eat less, and be mindful of the quality of the carbs you're eating. Like maybe you have blueberries and maybe you have some squash, but I'm not saying like sit down with a big bowl, a big thing of Ezekiel bread and have granola. No, those are the things that are going to create a metabolic disaster for your blood sugar. So I think it's certainly really important to lean into the protein. I always say protein is always the focus. And then if you're doing lower carb, you can increase your fats. If you're having higher carb, you decrease your fats in your meal. And then that way you're kind of finding this balance, but it may require a couple weeks of experimentation. And the other thing is we're so rigidly dogmatic. Everyone wants to be put in a bucket: carnivore, paleo, primal, keto, plant-based, etc. And so I remind people there are beautiful aspects of a lot of those methodologies. Like there's something to take away from each one of them. I was full carnivore for 9 months after being hospitalized because my gut was a wreck. I'm back to being, I would say, low carb paleo-ish. That's where I kind of exist, carnivore-ish, depending on the day. But finding what works best for your body. But I find for a lot of women that when they push that protein lever, they're so satiated. They're not looking for chips. They're not looking for chocolate. They're not looking for ice cream. And one thing I do want to mention is alcohol. And it's not a judgment, but alcohol is a huge problem, especially for middle-aged women, in the response that they're already dealing with sleep issues. And then they consume something that dysregulates their blood sugar, suppresses melatonin, increases cortisol. So I want you to think about the fact that alcohol is processed first in the body as a toxin. So everything else you eat along with that is getting stored as fat. And that's a really important distinction. So for a lot of women, when we're starting off like together, I'll just say, I'm not saying don't drink alcohol, just be mindful of how it impacts your sleep, your food choices. And sometimes that awareness can build into people saying, you know what, I'm going to have a glass of wine on Saturday night. I'm not going to have a glass of wine every night, because that can be a huge, huge issue. But I'm so glad that you asked about the macros piece. And I'm sorry, I forgot your other question. Oh, where can we get the book? Intermittent Fasting Transformation, you can find it off my website, on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Target, your local booksellers.
Go check out her book. Obviously, she's very passionate, very knowledgeable, and is offering a lot of things that most people aren't talking about in these other wellness books. So thank you, Cynthia, for your time. It's been lovely. I love your book. I love your work. And thanks for sharing your day with me.
Thanks for having me.